On a set filled with towering green screens and imaginary monsters, one 9-year-old girl walked in with no acting experience and walked out having redefined what a blockbuster performance could look like. Her name was Kaylee Hottle, and before the world knew her as Ja from Godzilla vs. Kong, she was simply a little girl from Atlanta who grew up signing before she ever learned to write her own name. Today, we remember her not for a fortune or a headline, but for the quiet, powerful way she changed an entire industry's understanding of who gets to tell a story. Kaylee was born in 2007 into a family where American Sign Language was not something learned in a classroom, but something lived every single day. Both of her parents were deaf, and her father's side of the family carried 4 generations of deaf relatives before her. In that household, ASL was not a second language or an accommodation. It was simply how love, jokes, comfort, and everyday conversation moved between people. Kaylee absorbed it the way any child absorbs the language spoken around them, and it became the foundation of everything she would later bring to the screen. She grew up attending the Texas School for the Deaf in Austin, where she balanced her studies with track and field and the ordinary rhythms of childhood. She was, by every account from those who knew her, warm, funny, and endlessly curious. Long before Hollywood found her, she appeared in a handful of commercials and public awareness campaigns focused on the deaf community, including a spot for a video relay service that helps deaf people communicate through interpreters. Those early appearances were never meant to launch a career. They were simply chances for a young girl to show up as herself in front of a camera, and that authenticity was exactly what caught the attention of casting professionals years later. When the filmmakers behind Godzilla vs. Kong went searching for someone to play Ja, a young deaf orphan with a singular bond to a giant ape, they were not looking for an actor who could imitate the experience of being deaf. They wanted someone who lived it. Kaylee, then just 9 years old, walked into that audition with no formal training and left with a role that would introduce her to the entire world. She did not need to manufacture emotion or borrow someone else's understanding of deafness and sign language. She simply brought her own life into the character, and audiences felt the difference immediately. Playing opposite a character created entirely through visual effects was no small task for any actor, let alone a child making her screen debut. Kong did not exist on set. Kaylee had to imagine his presence, react to markers and stand-ins, and trust that a team of artists would eventually bring the connection to life in post-production. She did this with a level of focus and professionalism that impressed everyone around her, including her adult co-stars. Rebecca Hall, who played her on-screen mother, Dr. Eileen Andrews, would later say their bond went far beyond the script. Hall took the time to learn American Sign Language herself, so she could communicate with Kaylee directly, and that off-screen friendship became one of the most meaningful relationships of Kaylee's young career. When Godzilla vs. Kong premiered in 2021, critics and audiences alike singled out Ja as the emotional center of a film otherwise built around spectacle. In a movie about 2 colossal creatures battling across cities, it was the quiet scenes between a small girl and a giant ape, communicated entirely through sign language and expression, that people remembered most. Kaylee proved something that is easy to forget in an industry built on dialogue, that a performance does not need spoken words to move an audience. It needs honesty, and she delivered that honesty at an age when most children are still learning to read. Her portrayal carried weight far beyond the box office. For deaf children watching from their own living rooms, many for the first time, here was someone who looked like them, communicated like them, and stood at the center of one of the biggest movies in the world. She was not a side character defined by her deafness. She was the heart of the story. That distinction mattered enormously to a community that had long been underrepresented or misrepresented on screen. Kaylee did not set out to be a symbol. She simply acted the way she knew how, and in doing so, she became one anyway. 3 years later, she returned to the role in Godzilla x Kong, the new empire, reprising Ja with even more confidence and range. Casting directors and producers now trusted her not as a novelty, but as a genuine talent, someone capable of carrying emotional scenes in a major franchise. Her performance in the sequel earned her a nomination for the Saturn Award for Best Performance by a Younger Actor, a recognition of just how far she had grown as a performer in a short amount of time. She was, by then, no longer simply the deaf girl who got lucky in a monster movie. She was an actress with a future that seemed to stretch as far as she wanted to take it. Those who worked alongside her often described the same things: her kindness, her work ethic, and the way she carried herself with maturity that belied her age. She balanced her growing public profile with an ordinary teenage life back home, staying close to her family and continuing her education as a senior at the Texas School for the Deaf. Fame did not seem to change the parts of her that people loved most. She remained, by every account, deeply connected to her roots and to the deaf community that had shaped her from birth. That is what makes the news of July 2026 so difficult to sit with. On the 21st of that month, Kaylee was riding in a car with two others on a road in Frederick County, Maryland, when the vehicle left the roadway and crashed. She was 18 years old. Emergency responders arrived in the early hours of the morning and worked quickly to get her the care she needed, including a flight by helicopter to a nearby trauma center. Despite those efforts, she could not be saved. The driver and the other passengers survived, and investigators later determined that speed was likely a factor in the crash, ruling her death an accident. Her father, Joshua Hottle, shared the news with the world in the way his family had always communicated, through a heartfelt video message in American Sign Language posted to social media. He spoke of the years he had with his daughter with a mixture of grief and gratitude, a father trying to find words, or in his case signs, for a loss that words were never built to hold. Her mother, Ketsi, shared her own tribute soon after, describing the privilege of being Kaylee's mom. The Texas School for the Deaf confirmed the loss to its community, remembering her as a beloved senior whose absence would be felt deeply among classmates and teachers alike. The response from Hollywood was immediate and heartfelt. Millie Bobby Brown, who had shared the screen with Kaylee in the original film, posted an emotional tribute expressing how devastated she was by the news. Rebecca Hall shared photographs from their years working together, writing that her heart went out to family and that Kaylee would be deeply missed. Isa Gonzalez, another castmate, described her as devastated and called Kaylee one of the sweetest, kindest people she had known. Legendary Pictures, the studio behind the MonsterVerse films, released a formal statement calling her a cherished member of their film family, praising the heart, humanity, and light she brought to every scene she was part of, and extending condolences to everyone who loved her. The response from Hollywood was immediate and heartfelt. Millie Bobby Brown, who had shared the screen with Kaylee in the original film, posted an emotional tribute expressing how devastated she was by the news. Rebecca Hall shared photographs from their years working together, writing that her heart went out to the family and that Kaylee would be deeply missed. Isa Gonzalez, another castmate, described her as devastated and called Kaylee one of the sweetest, kindest people she had known. Legendary Pictures, the studio behind the MonsterVerse films, released a formal statement calling her a cherished member of their film family, praising the heart, humanity, and light she brought to every scene she was part of, and extending condolences to everyone who loved her. Perhaps the most poignant tribute came from within the deaf community itself. Marlee Matlin, the Oscar-winning actress and longtime advocate for deaf representation in entertainment, had met Kaylee in person during a visit to her high school the year before. Matlin described herself as absolutely heartbroken by the loss, writing that Kaylee's beauty and talent deserved to be remembered forever. For Matlin, who had spent decades fighting for space in an industry that too often overlooked deaf performers, watching a young actress like Kaylee rise so quickly and so authentically must have felt like watching the future arrive. Her tribute was not just professional courtesy. It was one generation of trailblazers honoring the next. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what Kaylee's career actually represented, separate from any headline about box office numbers or industry buzz. She proved, at an age when most people are just discovering what they might want to do with their lives, that representation on screen is not a checkbox or a trend. It is a responsibility that, when done right, changes how millions of people see themselves and each other. Deaf children who watch Godzilla vs. Kong did not just see a monster movie. Many of them saw, for the first time, a version of themselves as the emotional core of a story that mattered to the whole world. That is not a small thing. That is a kind of impact that outlives box office charts and awards nominations entirely. Her advocacy did not stop at the screen either. Through interviews, appearances, and simply by existing publicly as a proud member of the deaf community, Kaylee helped spark conversations about accessibility and inclusion that reached far beyond entertainment. People who had never learned a single sign before watching her performances found themselves curious about American Sign Language and the culture surrounding it. That ripple effect, quiet and hard to measure, may end up being one of the most lasting parts of her legacy. What stands out most, looking back across her short but remarkable career, is how little of it seemed to be about ambition in the traditional Hollywood sense. She was not chasing fame. She was simply herself, in front of a camera, telling a story that happened to resonate with millions of people around the world. Her family and community shaped who she was long before any casting director discovered her, and that foundation never wavered even as her world grew larger. She remained, until the very end, a daughter, a student, a friend, and a proud member of a community that had given her everything she needed to become who she was. It helps to understand just how unusual her path into acting really was. Most child actors spend years in workshops, auditions, and small roles before landing something as significant as a role in a franchise built around two of cinema's most recognizable monsters. Kaylee had none of that traditional runway. She had a childhood spent surrounded by sign language, a family that never once treated her deafness as a limitation, and a natural comfort in front of a camera that came from years of appearing in community projects rather than formal training. When the opportunity to audition for Ja arrived, she did not have a portfolio of past roles to draw from. She had only herself, and it turned out that was more than enough. The character of Ja was written as the last known member of a fictional community called the Iwi, a girl who had lost her people and found an unexpected connection with Kong instead. On paper, that could have easily become a role defined by tragedy and silence. Instead, under Kaylee's performance, Ja became defined by warmth, curiosity, and quiet bravery. She was never a passive presence waiting to be rescued. She was often the one who understood Kong better than any of the adult scientists around her, the one whose instincts and communication skills the story leaned on when everything else fell apart. That reversal, a child character holding more insight than the grown experts surrounding her, gave the film an emotional anchor that action and special effects alone could never provide. Behind the scenes, Director Adam Wingard and the production team made a deliberate choice to treat sign language not as a novelty or a plot device, but as a genuine, respected form of communication within the world of the film. Kong himself was given simple signs to use with Ja, creating a form of connection between man and monster that had never quite been attempted in a film of the scale before. For many viewers who had never been exposed to ASL in any meaningful way, watching Ja and Kong communicate without a single spoken word became an unexpected introduction to a language and a culture they had known little about. That small creative decision, paired with Kaylee's performance, opened a door for countless conversations about deaf culture that reach well beyond film criticism. It is also worth remembering how much trust the studio placed in a first-time child actor to help center emotionally the story of a major blockbuster. That trust was not misplaced. Kaylee returned for the sequel not because of contractual obligation, but because producers and her fellow cast members recognized how much she had contributed to the franchise's success. By the time Godzilla x Kong, the new empire, arrived in theaters, she was no longer an unknown newcomer being given a chance. She was a returning cast member whose growth as a performer audiences could visibly see from one film to the next, and whose Saturn Award nomination reflected an industry beginning to take her seriously as an actress in her own right, not simply as a heartwarming casting choice. Away from the cameras, those closest to her painted a picture of someone remarkably grounded for a teenager suddenly thrust into global recognition. She continued to attend classes, compete in track and field, and spend time with friends and family who had known her long before Godzilla vs. Kong ever existed. Interviews from her years in the spotlight consistently describe her as friendly, hardworking, and dedicated to her craft. Someone who treated her growing platform as an opportunity to represent her community, well, rather than a chance to chase celebrity for its own sake. That balance between a very public role and a very private, very ordinary life at home seemed to be something she navigated with unusual grace for someone so young. The outpouring of grief following her death reflected just how far that grace had traveled. Beyond the tributes from her co-stars in the studio, members of the broader deaf community spoke about what her presence in a major franchise had meant to them personally. For years, deaf actors had often been relegated to minor roles or excluded from mainstream productions altogether. Kaylee's casting, and more importantly her success in the role, offered proof that a deaf performer could not only appear in a tentpole franchise, but could become the emotional heart of it. Advocates and educators pointed to her as an example of what authentic casting looks like when studios commit to it fully rather than treating representation as an afterthought. Kaylee Hottle's story did not get the ending anyone wanted for her. 18 years is far too short a time to have made the impact she made, and the grief felt by her family, her castmates, and the deaf community around the world reflects just how much she meant to the people who knew her, both in person and through a screen. But the mark she left behind is not measured in years. It is measured in every young deaf child who now believes a leading role in a major film is possible for them too. It is measured in the friendships she built on set that turned into lifelong bonds. It is measured in an industry that, because of her, has one more reason to keep opening doors it once kept closed. She will be remembered as Ja, the girl who could speak to a giant without ever saying a word out loud. But more than that, she will be remembered as Kaylee, a daughter who made her parents proud, a student who represented her school with pride, and a young woman who showed the world that talent, warmth, and authenticity need no translation. Rest in peace, Kaylee Hottle. Your light reached further than you ever knew.